Before I give a fulsome introduction, all of which I believe, by the way, I want to introduce the person who made this possible, my wonderful cousin, Nancy Marzella. Stand up, stand up. Generous as always in so many things. It is really my delight to introduce to you Susan Reynolds, a former student of mine, now academic star, who is an associate professor of Catholic Studies at Emory University's Candler School of Theology in Atlanta. She is the author of People Get Ready, Ritual, Solidarity, and Lived Eschatology in Catholic Roxbury, published by Fordham University Press in 2023. Her research on the clergy's sexual abuse in migrant contexts has received awards from the Catholic Theological Society of America and Fordham University's Curran Center for American Catholic Studies. She is a contributing editor to Commonweal magazine and is currently a fellow at Emory's Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry. Please join me in welcoming Susan Reynolds.
Thank you so much to Mark Massa for the invitation to join you all this evening, and of course to Nancy Marzella for endowing this lecture. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you so much to Susan Richard and Maddie Jarrett for all of the work that you did on the back end to make this such a lovely visit. It's always a joy to be back at Boston College, the place where my own fascination with the study of American Catholicism began. In fact, what began as a final paper I wrote in Father Massa's Catholics in American Culture course here in 2012 eventually grew up to be my first book, People Get Ready. So I owe a great deal to this place, and it's always wonderful to return. Today I'm going to talk about clergy sexual abuse, something that is certainly no foreign topic to Catholics here in Boston. And specifically, I'll be offering some thoughts about the role of women in the crisis. I'm not here to propose a grand theory so much as gleanings from my own engagement with certain kinds of archival materials and particular histories. But I want to preface my remarks by saying just a bit about how I situate myself within the study of this complicated topic, how I came to this work, and the factors that motivate my approach. So a couple of years ago, as Mark noted, I published a book based on an ethnographic study of St. Mary of the Angels, which is a small, rebellious Catholic parish in Roxbury's Eggleston Square neighborhood, where I lived as a BC graduate student. One of the most stunning and disturbing discoveries I made in the process of writing that book came very late. So late that it can't even be found in the main text of the book, but rather in a very long endnote. During the 1970s, Roxbury clergy would occasionally meet to discuss the many challenges that were facing the church in the inner city. They would write letters to the archdiocese making recommendations and requests and demands, all of which were summarily ignored. But they are preserved faithfully in the archdiocesan archives. During one visit to the archives in Braintree, the archivists, who are remarkable, by the way, I see a lot of students with us today. If you ever want to do archival research in the Archdiocese of Boston, the archivists there, I cannot say enough good things. They pulled some files for me on Roxbury parishes that contain the handwritten minutes from some of these meetings throughout the 1970s of Roxbury clergy. And in the notes from one such meeting, in June 1976, a priest at St. Joseph's Parish, which is another church in Roxbury, complained on record that one problem facing the church in the inner city was that bishops seemed to be sending so-called displaced priests to the inner city. Displaced was obviously code, a euphemism for priests who had been forced out of their parishes because of trouble that they had caused. The remark was striking on its own, because it suggested that class and urban geography played a systemic role in the dynamics of abuse. You've got a predator on your hands, send him to the inner city, to poor neighborhoods, to people whose cries are easy to ignore, people too afraid to call the police to file a complaint. This is something that colleagues who study missionary histories in Indian lands have known for a long time, right? In that context, Native American reservations, boarding schools, in geographically remote and rural churches and dioceses were regularly used as so-called dumping grounds for predatory priests. Here we see a similar dynamic at play in inner cities. But the comment was even more striking and frankly twisted when I researched the man who made it, Father Doja Wilson. It had, just like any good, faithful, record keeper of meeting minutes, it said who made the comment. And then, so I looked up Father Wilson. Wilson had been ordained in the Diocese of Albany, New York, not in Boston. And he himself had been displaced to Roxbury after he was accused of sexually assaulting 2 boys. Both the Bishop of Albany and the Albany District Attorney agreed to let Wilson leave the area rather than face prosecution. So they sent him to Roxbury, a primarily Black and Caribbean neighborhood, which by the 1970s had become sort of synonymous in Boston with urban poverty. He was appointed parish administrator of St. Joseph's under the auspices of Boston's Cardinal Umberto Medeiros, storied author of Man's Cities and God's Poor. At St. Joseph's, Wilson was again accused of sexual abuse. He was sent to a treatment center in Worcester and left Roxbury in 1979. This late in the game discovery haunted me. How would that book chapter or the entire book have been different if that detail had made its way out of the endnotes? What if I'd started there instead of ended there? What else in the archives hadn't I seen because I didn't yet understand what I was looking at? It would not merely have disrupted the narrative, it would have forced me to tell a different, bigger, darker, and perhaps truer story about the confluence of urban Catholic space, racialization, and the exercise of authority. I begin with this example, a story that is in some ways indistinguishable from so many other stories that line the archives and even more that have gone undocumented. It is a bit of a self-critical example of how my own understanding of clergy sexual abuse in theological and historical studies has developed over the past several years. So in my current research on the church, I'm particularly invested in understanding what structural forces such as place, race, class, geography, and migration have to do with clergy abuse as it's perpetrated, as it's covered up, and as it's addressed. This invitation by the Boise Center afforded me a much desired opportunity to look more closely at another such dimension of power, that of gender. Academic studies and journalistic investigations of Catholic clergy sexual abuse largely center the experiences of men and boys. In what we might call the grand narrative of clergy sexual abuse, victims, perpetrators, and supporting characters are all implicitly male. Bishops, priests, deacons, seminarians, altar boys, schoolboys, and so on. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that in the popular imagination, Catholic clergy sexual abuse is male-coded. It's this male-codedness that implicitly distinguishes it as Catholic. Whereas the sex abuse scandals that erupt in Protestant and evangelical churches often have to do with sexually coercive behavior of male pastors vis-a-vis female congregants and staff, the typical image of abuse in Catholic context centers 2 caricatures, the priest and the altar boy. There's a historical basis for the perceived male-codedness of clerical sex. Within early Christianities, we're talking 4th century onward, religious authorities' insistence on clerical celibacy forced sexually active clergy, of whom there were many, into what Diane Elliott calls a particularly capacious closet. Even though same-sex relations were still regarded as far more sinful than opposite-sex fornication or adultery, religious authorities cracked down much more vigorously and publicly on clerical relationships with women in the form of clerical wives and concubines in the families they created. Preoccupied with preventing scandal, scandal understood as that which could cause the faithful to separate themselves from the sacraments and the liturgy and thus from God, it was natural that authorities would be more preoccupied with the kinds of relationships that bore fruit, literally. Men were safe sexual partners. Because violations of clerical celibacy were so common, it gave rise to a culture of secrecy and protectionism. In monasteries, junior seminaries, choir schools, and other institutions where child or adolescent boys, often those without parental care, lived among grown men, boys were also a target for clerical sexual appetites. Today, we tend to perceive children as pure and innocent, but historically and ecclesially within the church, children were viewed as sort of morally ambivalent subjects at best, sources of temptation, both corruptible and corrupting. In turn, injunctions against pederasty, sex with children, in monasteries often placed the blame for abuse on minors, not on their adult abusers for being tempted. Like children, women in the church have long been viewed as ambiguous subjects, morally suspect, inherently uncredible, driven by ulterior and worldly motives, and always and fundamentally living embodiments of temptation for clerical males. Willfully ignoring the power asymmetries present in clerical culture, authorities could easily reclassify acts of sexual violence committed against women by priests as mutual, consensual sexual transgressions, the fault of both parties and principally of the female temptress. Yet women and girls are and always have been part of the story of abuse in the church. They are victims and survivors. They are mothers and aunts and sisters, nuns, religious sisters and postulants. They are teachers and whistleblowers and mandated reporters. They're bystanders, they're clerical defenders, they're diocesan employees, they're lay ministers and lawyers and investigative reporters and scholars and psychologists and doctors. They're apologists and they're even perpetrators. How does our contemporary understanding of abuse in the church deepen when we shift our focus to the subjectivities of women and girls? How do these more hidden stories reveal a larger and more complex story about power in the church? And what hopes might we articulate for a just future? I hope it's clear that my intention in examining the role of women within the context of clergy abuse is not to suggest that the experiences of boys and men have been somehow overplayed or to weigh the circumstances of some against those of others in order to establish a hierarchy of suffering. The core insight of the set of theories that have become known as intersectionality is that in any situation where justice is denied and demanded, it matters who our implicit subjects are. It matters that we understand who we're talking about. Without a capacious understanding of how gender intersects with other structures of power within the church, policy interventions and theological constructions that might seem like progress for some could ultimately end up writing others out of the narrative altogether. So I'll begin by discussing the status of women and girls within our traditional categories of victim and perpetrator. And after that, I'll offer the story of an abuse case that I've worked on quite closely, in which women are neither victim nor perpetrator, but instead occupy the spaces in between. It's here, I think, that the ambiguous status of women in the church really comes into sharpest relief, where we begin to grasp the complicated and multi-layered intersection of gender, sex, and power in the institutional church. I'll conclude with a few thoughts on the path forward as I see it. So to begin, women and girls as victims and survivors of clerical abuse. While studies differ in their conclusions, we can estimate that about 1/3 of minor victims of clerical sexual abuse are girls. Such abuse follows the pattern that we've come to understand is typical of pedophilic clerical abuse. Abusers ingratiate themselves with a child's parents or families, establishing relationships of trust and even the perception of familial privilege, how lucky we are that we are friends with the priest. There's grooming and manipulation. The abuser seeks out opportunities to be alone with the child, whether in the child's home or on church property, often leveraging spaces such as the confessional, rectory, or a private office, spaces that are not only physically isolated, but also carry profound symbolic overtures of secrecy, confidentiality, sin, and obedience. Sexual abuse is often accompanied by rhetorical spiritualization. That is, the abuser tells the child that God wants this, that what's being done to them is holy or bound up with sacramental preparation or reception, or is a form of religious or sexual education. The abuser tries to exact promises of secrecy through threats, spiritual blackmail, or manipulation. However, even in some cases when the victim tells others what has happened to her, the preferential status afforded to the priest means that she is disbelieved and questioned and even blamed by trusted adults, sometimes including her own family members. In general, the greater a girl's social vulnerability, the greater the risk for abuse. In an American Catholic context, nowhere is this demonstrated more clearly and distressingly than in histories of Native American boarding schools. Native writer and scholar Denise Lajimodieri, a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Pembina Chippewa, compiles oral histories of Indian boarding school survivals in her book, Stringing Rosaries, The History, the Unforgivable, and the Healing of Northern Plains American Indian Boarding School Survivors, a book that I commend to you all. What about adult women? In fact, according to the John Jay report, most clerical sexual misconduct involves adults, not minors, despite our sort of popular perception. The late psychotherapist and clergy sex abuse researcher Richard Sight estimated that 4 times as many priests involve themselves sexually with adult women and twice the number with adult men as priests who involve themselves sexually with children. As I said earlier, speaking rightly of sexual abuse in these cases is often complicated by the tacit perception that such situations are consensual at best and the fault of the women at worst. The plight of women religious, sisters and nuns, merits particular attention. In 1994, Sister Maura O'Donoghue and Sister Marie McDonald compiled a comprehensive report detailing a pervasive culture of rape of nuns by priests across the continent of Africa. As HIV and AIDS spread across the continent, nuns were viewed as safe sexual partners for priests who feared contracting HIV by engaging in sexual contact with men, sex workers, or ordinary lay women. Nuns who became pregnant were often forced to have abortions paid for by priests. While the AIDS crisis gave particular shape to the situation in Africa, the same pattern of sexual and reproductive abuse has been identified all over the world. Nuns from France, India, Chile, Italy, and beyond have reported rape at the hands of priests and bishops, many of whom continue to serve in ordained ministry with impunity. In 2005, Pope Benedict responded to reports that a women's religious congregation was being used essentially as sexual slaves by dissolving the congregation of women. So that's interesting, right? Not so much disciplining the men. In India, Bishop Franco Mulakal of the Diocese of Jalandhar was arrested for repeated rape of a nun, the first case of its kind, in January 2022, despite the testimony of nearly 40 witnesses and a global outpouring of attention. Mulakal was acquitted of all charges. The nun, on the other hand, was forced to flee her home because of threats on her life. After the 2018 release of the Pennsylvania grand jury report catalyzed a global reckoning with sexual abuse in the church, and somewhat at the same time, the Me Too movement emboldened women to share stories of abuse, women religious all over the world spoke out for the first time about stories of rape and exploitation at the hands of male priests and religious superiors. Cries for reform were even issued by women within the Vatican. In February 2019, the publication Women Church World, which is a sort of a monthly supplement, kind of like the New York Times Magazine, within the official Vatican newspaper, Osservatore Romano, published an expose detailing and decrying this global pattern of rape and forced abortions. The publication's editor traced the culture of abuse to the persistently unrecognized status of women in the church. She wrote, "It is on this obvious lack of recognition of women that is grafted the culture of abuses which makes possible a massive practice of bullying arrogance unworthy of any Christian." It's translated from Italian. Not long after the report was published, the publication's editor and nearly the entire production staff had to resign when the Vatican press office brought the publication under male control. Finally, it's worth noting that women and girls are victims of abuse not only by ordained clergy, but by other men in the church afforded a spiritualized status. The cases of L'Arche founder Jean Vanier and liturgical composer David Haas are but two well-known examples. Neither Vanier nor Haas was ordained. However, both used spiritual authority and charisma as instruments of sexual and psychological manipulation and intimidation. Researcher Katie Holscher once offered a shorthanded definition of clericalism as the idea that priests are very special people. Though glib, I find the definition quite useful. Victims of both Vanier and Haas have testified to the ways in which both men's public identities and self-conceptions as very special people both facilitated a particular form of exploitation and enforced silence among victims. Women are also perpetrators. It's worth noting that women in the church have perpetrated abuse in many forms: sexual, physical, spiritual, and psychological. And here, conscious of time and the limits of my own expertise, I'm not going to actually say much beyond acknowledging the reality, not beyond because it's not important, but because it's not the locus of my study, and I'm conscious of my limited time. But it's important to note too that when one is in a culture with very specific kinds of power relations and hierarchies, one is not immune from perpetrating the kinds of abuses that culture facilitates. Attending to the complicated contours of abuse in the church, I think, invites us also to attend to the stories of women who are neither primary victim nor perpetrator, but part of the broader ecclesial ecology. Here I want to shift and share a story from the archives that I've worked on quite closely, a story in which we meet women not as principal actors, but as fragments. They appear to us in scribbled memos and typewritten reports and confusingly redacted notes. What do we glean about power in the church by attending as best we can to them? On November 6, 1984, a typewritten memo marked "Very Confidential" arrived on the desk of Washington, D.C. Archbishop James Hickey. The memo detailed a disturbing report from a nun named Sister Manuela, who worked as an advocate for the Hispanic community in Washington, D.C. Sister Manuela reported that a woman had recently come to see her about a situation involving her 19-year-old nephew. The young man had immigrated to Los Angeles from Mexico 4 years earlier, along with his mother and 10 siblings. The family was undocumented, and their father was still in Mexico. Upon arriving in Los Angeles, the family found St. Marcellinus Catholic Church in the City of Commerce. There they met Father Peter Garcia, director of the Spanish-speaking apostolate for the Archdiocese of LA. Monsignor Garcia went out of his way to help the family. He enrolled the children in Catholic school and rented the poor family a home. Garcia even invited the oldest son, 16 years old at the time, to come live with him. It was a charitable proposal, a way of helping to relieve the mother of the burden of providing for such a large family. The boy refused to go, but his parents insisted. By all accounts, Garcia was charismatic, popular, charming, and well-connected, a powerful and trustworthy ally in a new country. Almost immediately, however, Garcia began sexually and psychologically abusing the teenage boy. After the first time it happened, Garcia drove the boy to the local jail and, quote, instructed him either to behave or else he would end up either in jail or back in Mexico. Underscoring the power Garcia wielded in the local community, he reportedly threatened the boy. If you talk, I have lawyer friends and I will surely have you deported. Blackmailed into silence, the boy and two of his younger brothers were victimized by Garcia for the next 3 years. By the time their aunt discovered and reported the abuse to Sister Manuela, the young man had moved across the country to live with her in DC. He'd descended into profound mental illness and apparent drug addiction. His aunt told Sister Manuela that he had covered the walls of his room in images of Our Lady of Guadalupe. At that point, the boy's entire family felt that they had no choice but to get out of LA. They feared the priest is powerful, Sister Manuela reported. The memo continued. He could send the whole family back to Mexico, and they do not rule out even physical violence, of which they are also afraid. Garcia had 12 different parish assignments between 1966 and 1987. 2 of these lasted just 2 months. Another lasted 5 months, another lasted 8 months. Reports contained in Garcia's unsealed personnel file revealed that beginning in 1966, the year he was ordained, Garcia abused at least 20 young boys and adolescents, the youngest of whom was around 7. Based on conversations that I've had subsequently with lawyers and people close to the Garcia case, we now know that the actual number was considerably higher. Most of his victims were parochial school students and altar servers at the parishes where he served. Many were brothers or cousins. By the time Sister Manuela contacted church authorities in 1984, records show that bishops had been aware of Garcia's behavior for nearly a decade at least, having received the first recorded allegation against him in 1975. Yet despite his unremitting pattern of sexual violence and the cascade of reports against him, Garcia was kept in active ministry, shuffled from parish to parish. It was 1980 before his superiors first referred him to psychiatric treatment, a referral paired not with removal from ministry, but instead with yet another new parish assignment and a promotion from secretary to director of the Archdiocesan Spanish-speaking apostolate. After Sister Manuela's report, Garcia was sent away for treatment. He was sent to Jemez Springs, New Mexico, for a lengthy stay at the now notorious Foundation House Rehabilitation Center run by the Servants of the Paraclete. There, despite being officially designated as on sick leave from the Archdiocese of LA, authorities permitted him to hold 2 successive parish ministry assignments in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. Of course, explaining the sudden appearance of this LA diocesan priest in New Mexico could prove awkward, suggested Foundation House Director Reverend William Perry, especially if Garcia were to be actively supervised in ministry by treatment program staff. Thus, in a letter to LA Archbishop Roger Mahoney, Perry explained that he and Santa Fe Archbishop Robert Sanchez had resolved that Garcia should be placed into ministry without supervision, and that the community should be told nothing whatsoever about his history. Instead, Garcia should simply be very responsible. By 1987, annoyed by Mahoney's unwillingness to let him return to parish ministry in LA, Garcia became increasingly uncompliant with the Servants of the Paraclete outpatient treatment program in which he was enrolled. The letters Garcia sent to the Chancery took on an increasingly evasive, sometimes aggressive tone. Foundation House staff, previously affirming of his participation in their program, began to describe him as slippery, sneaky, and untrustworthy. As Garcia's relationships with superiors deteriorated, Mahoney appeared to lose patience with him. In late summer 1987, Mahoney referred him to the Daughters of Charity run St. Luke Institute in Suitland, Maryland, for further evaluation. Once there, a lengthy report to Mahoney explicitly described Garcia's pattern of sexually abusing undocumented minors. According to the report, quote, although Father Garcia does not perceive himself as coercive in these behaviors, it's our understanding that many, if not most, of the minors with whom he was involved were undocumented aliens. Their term. They may well have felt threatened by the consequences of their making formal allegations to one archdiocese or legal complaints against Monsignor Garcia. Responding to Garcia's ongoing persuasion campaign to return to his home in LA, Manning declared that Garcia was not to come to California under any circumstances. Presumably addressing Foundation House staff, he continued, if Peter is seen by certain parents, he could get 10 years in prison. The statute of limitations will not expire until the young man is 21 years of age. The parents can continue to pursue Peter until that time. He also stated that the parents are just waiting for such a legal suit. 2 years later, as Garcia continued to beg to return to LA, Foundation House Program Director Perry wrote to Archbishop Mahoney that the program was merely trying to prevent Monsignor Garcia from further trouble and a possible prison sentence. In addition, they write that they are seeking to protect the church at large, as we all want to do. 2 months later, after a visit to Jemez Springs, it was confirmed in writing that the liability of Garcia returning to LA is too great, as there are numerous adolescents or young adults that Peter was involved with in a first-degree felony manner. It's fascinating that all of this is in writing because it directly contradicts the Archdiocese of LA's present claim that there was no insistence in which prosecution was delayed or prevented by the offending priest being sent out of state for treatment, a statement that is currently on their website. Thus, we see one instance of how the peripheries bore in dramatic and disproportionate fashion the geographic consequences of bishops' strategic determination to shield abusive priests and their diocese from liability. So in this story, we meet 3 women. We might not have noticed them because they were peripheral characters, but we met 3 women directly. First, we met a religious sister named Sister Manuela, an advocate for the Hispanic Catholic community in Washington, D.C., the whistleblower in this case. Second, we met the victim's aunt, concerned for the well-being of her 19-year-old nephew and alarmed by what he has finally told her. And third, we meet a Mexican Catholic immigrant mother of 11 children, alone in a new country. We meet other women indirectly, the victim's many sisters, the Daughters of Charity who founded the St. Luke Rehab Institute, the women and girls in Garcia's many parishes, and even Our Lady of Guadalupe, whose evocative image the victim plastered all over his room, as we hear in that haunting vignette from his aunt. Everyone we meet, save for Garcia himself, is a reflection in a broken mirror, fractal, fragmented, and interpreted and reinterpreted by the documentary evidence that we have. As we attend to the role of gender in this particular account, I want to draw our attention to 3 specific intersections. First, the intersection of gender, culture, and migration. Second, the intersection of gender and credibility. And third, finally, by way of conclusion, the intersection of gender and power in the church. So first, the intersection of gender and legal documentation and culture. As political philosopher Amy Sandoval Reid argues, living undocumented in the United States entails far more than an ongoing lack of legal status. Undocumented migrants in the US endure social undocumentation, a gendered and racialized state of precarity and social invisibility. At the center of this undocumented existence is the body, upon which the consequences of living a life hidden from authorities are written in a host of violent ways. In the Garcia case, the undocumented legal and social status of the victim's mother directly shaped dynamics of abuse and its aftermath. It's clear from psychological evaluations and internal archdiocesan communications that Garcia targeted his victims precisely because they came from undocumented or otherwise vulnerable families. The priest would leverage his clerical power and Spanish-speaking apostolate leadership to access, assist, and engender trust from newly arrived immigrant families, often women traveling with multiple children whose husbands were still in Mexico. In providing necessities like housing and schooling for these vulnerable women's families, Garcia created a relationship of multifaceted dependence in which he assumed traditional masculine roles of both economic provider and father figure. Garcia's cultural familiarity as Mexican American and his English-Spanish bilingualism granted him further access to power over the mothers whose sons he targeted. Positioning himself as a translator and thus as a kind of cultural gatekeeper between mothers and their new country, he made himself indispensable to them, gaining further control over their lives. Such trust and dependence gave Garcia access to women's sons. Records suggest that he would follow the typical pattern, isolating boys from their families, inviting them to empty rectories or on overnight trips to youth rallies and things like that. There, he would often give them wine or medication and then unleash violent physical aggression upon them. Afterwards, he would silence them using manipulation, threatening deportation, calling their homes, and continuing to ingratiate himself to their mothers, to such an extent that once revelations arose, several of the women in Garcia's file appeared as concerned for Garcia's welfare as for that of their sons. Garcia's abuse thus enacted corporeally, bodily, and psychologically the social violence of both legal undocumentation and male clerical supremacy. The practice of victim silencing is a common through line in accounts of clergy sexual abuse across contexts. The Garcia case demonstrates how abusers and their religious superiors often extracted silence in contextually situated ways, uniting threats of reprisal with vulnerabilities and taboos specific to a victim's cultural and familial situation. Here, for example, living under the threat of deportation exacted victim silence in a particularly violent and effective manner. For undocumented victims of sexual assault and other crimes, the legal and social precarity of undocumented life in the US functions as a significant barrier to reporting abuse, as you can imagine. While US citizens can, in theory, access the police, lawyers, healthcare, media, etc., undocumented victims have few places to turn for protection and advocacy. Fear of police interaction and warranted mistrust of healthcare, legal, and criminal justice systems deter victims from reporting crimes to authorities, constraining possibilities for redress and justice. For minors, concern over the problems that disclosing abuse could cause for undocumented family members adds additional psychological and practical barriers to reporting. Thus, undocumented victims of clergy sexual abuse face a double bind. Either they remain silent and continue to be harmed, or they report their abuse and risk deportation and harm to their family. Given the magnitude of these barriers, what makes the Garcia case extraordinary is that the victim's mother did secure legal representation. The Los Angeles Center for Law and Justice, an organization founded in the 1970s to provide legal advocacy to low-income migrant and Latino populations in the city, took the family's case in 1985. At this point, church officials weaponized their undocumented status in an additional way. While Garcia used threats, archdiocesan authorities took the opposite approach, diffusing the family's demands with a mix of damage control and feigned ignorance. When lawyers from LACLJ contacted the Archdiocese in September 1985 on the family's behalf, Archbishop Mahoney replied by claiming to know nothing of the origins of this entire matter. While Mahoney had only recently succeeded Cardinal Timothy Manning as head of the Archdiocese of LA, his claims of ignorance are very dubious. Even a cursory glance at Garcia's already very large personnel file would have revealed extensive documentation of the case. Behind the scenes, records show our archdiocesan leaders were scrambling to coordinate a response with their lawyers and the heads of Catholic charities attempting to preempt a lawsuit by offering counseling services to the family's children. Archdiocesan damage control, combined with the complications of pursuing legal justice while undocumented, meant that charges were never filed. Garcia, for his part, seemed confident that the Archdiocese would shield him from prosecution, would have his back. As Mary Gail Frawley O'Day notes, in a surprisingly high number of cases, priests confronted with allegations against them confess on the spot, admitting the incidents occurred and promising never to do it again. Such was the case with Garcia, whose shameless admissions of abuse on several occasions suggest a well-founded awareness that he would face few legal or ecclesiastical consequences. It's important to note that immigration status doesn't operate in a vacuum, but instead intersects with gender, ethnicity, class, culture, and church hierarchies and structures to yield complex power relationships. As we've already seen in Garcia's words, Mexican Catholic moral and theological norms around authority, redemptive suffering, and maternal assent, taboos related to homosexuality and sexual abuse, and the values of familial and community primacy are just some of the relevant themes at issue. Additionally, for newly arrived immigrant families, parishes functioned as spiritual, social, civic, and cultural centers of gravity. Thus, to report abuse was not only to risk deportation, it was also to risk profound religious and social alienation, to risk, in other words, separation from God and God's people. Garcia, of course, knew these obstacles well. He maintained a public profile as a vocal advocate for Hispanic Catholics. Leveraging cultural and religious insiderhood, he repeatedly sought to reassure superiors that victims' families, especially mothers, would never press charges. In a 1985 letter to Manning begging to return to Los Angeles, Garcia underscored that his victims' Catholicism meant that they would never pursue legal action. They do love their church, and even when hurt, do try to protect their priests and religious, he wrote. This is a very strong Hispanic characteristic. 2 years later, in yet another plea, this one to the Archbishop of Santa Fe, Garcia assured the prelate that the persons, quote, who would generally be looking for me are undocumented, so necessarily maintain a very low profile. He continued, the mother of the boys involved made a solemn promise to a comadre that they would never hurt my family or me in any way after all this happened. Generally, as you well know, Mexican people keep this type of promise very well. Here, Garcia framed legal action not only in terms of the harm it would bring to victims' families, but also to his own family. Manipulating traditional Mexican cultural values of feminism and religious promesas, Garcia secured his impunity. The second intersection I want to highlight, gender and credibility. Most of what we know about clergy abuse comes from archival documents. You might be thinking, how in the world do you know all of this? It's in the documents. Just read the documents, it's all there. Court depositions, victim testimonies, local histories, and especially the photocopied, methodically redacted contents of unsealed clergy personnel files. Within these files, we encounter internal communications, handwritten memos, psychological evaluations from, the 70s, teeming with optimistic, of-the-moment verbiage of sexual integration and the result of then novel personality assessments, abusers' correspondences to superiors plinked out in typewritten lines on parish letterhead, scribbled with the marginalia of recipients at the chancery. These primary documents form the raw materials of two distinct but closely related stories, that of violence carried out by priests, and even more vividly, the story of institutional clericalism manifested in a culture of limitless second chances for offenders, disregard for victims, and bishops' absolute knowledge of situations about which they would later publicly claim ignorance. In the case reported by Sister Manuela, for example, nearly everything we learn about the nature of Garcia's abuse is at least 4 degrees removed from the primary victim's own words. The clearest description of what happened to the boy during the 4 years he was being abused is contained in the initial memo written by a chancery official to Archbishop Hickey, who is recounting the report from Sister Manuela, who is narrating what she learned from the victim's aunt, who learned it from the victim himself. Throughout this chain of reporting, the account is translated from Spanish into English, from oral testimony to business memo, from the lexicon of personal trauma to advocacy to institutional base covering, from the sight of haunted memory to the banal materiality of office paper and manila folders. The closest thing to first-hand testimony in this case, in other words, is an interpretation of a translation of an interpretation, each layer of which is compounded by unique biases, interests, and understandings. The hermeneutical challenge involved in peeling back these layers is profound. Once this chain of reporting crosses the boundary between laity and chancery, however, interpretation and translation become willful distortion. The chancery official in Washington, D.C., who took Sister Manuela's report warned her not to refer the young man to a psychologist just yet until he had a chance to speak with the Archbishop. After church authorities in D.C. received the report, records show that they deployed patriarchal and clerical power to cast suspicion on its veracity by questioning the credibility of the victim's aunt and mother. A follow-up memo attached to the initial report from Hikita Manning concluded that Sister Manuela was credible, but concluded with the suggestion that church officials should not eliminate the possibility of an attempted ripoff, the family's attempt to get to the Washington area. In other words, despite the family's stated lack of desire for publicity or court action, and despite the magnitude and consistency of the allegations against Garcia, Hickey hinted demanding that maybe the whole thing was a fabrication. The aunt's suggestion that her sister's family needed to leave LA for their own safety was, they insinuated, merely a desperate, undocumented woman's ploy to trick church leaders into helping her family move across the country to join relatives. It's hard to imagine that church leaders genuinely believed the accusations that they were leveling against these women. Rather, allegations like these are consistent with broader strategy of victim intimidation and discreditation employed by church leaders in such cases. Within these primary documents, the voices of women and girls are especially ambiguous. Given the clerical context in which their testimonies are documented or not, retained or not, interpreted or misinterpreted, heard or ignored, and believed or dismissed, we can see how women's testimony is always at particular risk of erasure. In her 2024 Madaleva lecture, theologian Natalia Imperatori-Lee cites Mary Magdalene as the archetypal example of the tendency of male ecclesial authorities to dismiss the testimony of women as inherently uncredible and untrustworthy. In the church's credibility economy, Imperatori-Lee argues, women begin at a deficit. Women's voices are also difficult to hear in the archives because women are always lay people. In public disclosures, this means that they are always nameless. They are always redacted. I'll explain what I mean in a moment. Even Sister Manuela's name is redacted from the very incomplete version of the clergy personnel files turned over by the Archdiocese of LA. It appears actually in a much more complete version of the file archived by the lay-run archivebishopsaccountability.org. In some public disclosures, for obvious reasons, victim names and identifiers are redacted, along with the names of any other sort of ancillary figure. This is obviously a practice vital to ensuring confidentiality and, to be clear, is a very good thing. And, at the same time, redaction also recapitulates the erasure and identity loss that victims endure because it places the subjectivity of the abuser at the center of their stories, relegating them to the status of unnamed victim, anonymous number, or less, unaccounted for completely, present in absence alone. Even when invoked in notoriety, centering abusers reinforces the narcissism demonstrably operative in the actions of so many offenders, Garcia included. What's more, because unsealed clergy files are the primary source of documentary evidence in such cases, attending to these cases means wading through abusers' psychological evaluations, their letters to superiors, and the often jarringly sympathetic responses they received in reply, and their self-centered apologias. Here again, the subjectivity of the abuser is the centerpiece of such a file. He is the protagonist. Meanwhile, survivor voices and the voices of mothers and nuns and mandated reporters are reduced to court depositions, legal transcripts, and rare public statements. In most cases, victims and their families are partial subjects at best, known and heard only insofar as their stories are subsumed into that of their abuser, in whose protagonal tale they play the part of accusers, whistleblowers, or apologists. And I'll conclude here with a final intersection, a final point about gender and power. After the Boston Globe's famous 2002 Spotlight report, and again after the release of the Pennsylvania grand jury report, media attention focused largely, as we said, on prepubescent male victims. The typical victim of clergy abuse was an altar boy from a white, urban or suburban, middle class or working class Catholic family. The stories of girls and women, as well as the stories of migrants and Black, brown, and indigenous victims, received little to no public attention. Indeed, throughout the latter half of the 20th century, legal, social, archival, and spatial documentation coalesced to produce invisible victims, survivors whose identities occupied subaltern ranks of the racialized history of clergy abuse visibility, and consequently, whose stories have been written out of the master narrative of clergy sexual abuse. This hierarchy of visibility reflects and is shaped by other social hierarchies, race, class, and gender, that govern church and society, privileging white people over people of color, men over women, adults over children, middle class and wealthy over poor, urban over rural, ordained over lay, citizen over migrant, English speaker over Spanish speaker, and documented over undocumented. This fractional visibility of women and girls in the story of clergy abuse doesn't only tell an incomplete story about who survivors are. It also paints an incomplete picture of the role of power in ecclesial contexts. Power analyses of the abuse crisis often attribute the Catholic Church's culture of abuse to clericalism, right? This notion that ordination and sacramental authority confer upon clergy a superior status to that of laity. Accordingly, addressing clericalism by correcting what appears to be the primary power imbalances at stake in such cases by equalizing the roles of clergy and laity is the key to remedying the church's culture of abuse. As we've seen this evening, however, such proposals forget that clerical power doesn't operate in a vacuum. Rather, clericalism gains force by trading on other structures of domination based on gender, race, ethnicity, class, legal status, and age. Similarly, the Garcia case demonstrates that diocesan practices of covering up abuse would have been insufficient had they not intersected with other social hierarchies of visibility and invisibility. Garcia proceeded with a nearly bottomless well of second chances for 2 decades, not only because he was a priest, but because he was a priest in a church where the testimony of women and children are ignored and disbelieved, in a nation with a carceral immigration system, an institution that treated immigrants serving parishes as dumping grounds for abusers, in a justice system to which the poor and undocumented and often women lack equal access, and in a society where the vulnerable were systemically exploited. Understanding clerical abuse thus requires uncovering these larger matrices of domination that enable and act as cover for clerical violence. What's also clear is that the church ignores the testimony of women and girls at its own peril. There is simply not a credible future for an institution that finds the testimony of women incredible. The church, as an institution and as people, must practice listening to women and girls, migrant women, religious sisters, teenagers, mothers, grandmothers, children, all of us. This is my hope for the church, that we heed the voices of the prophets among us, those voices crying out in the desert, voices calling the church to repentance and reform, voices that refuse and voices that warn. It's November, which means that we're coming up on the end of the liturgical year and Advent is nearly upon us, the season when women are sometimes invited to preach or offer reflections about pregnancy and birth and waiting and joyful hope. Perhaps this Advent, we might turn a listening ear to those women who have dared to tell not only beautiful truths, but ugly ones, the truths we want to hear least and need to hear most. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Susan agreed to take some questions. Bring up a conversation. So, does anyone have questions for Susan?
Yes.
I grew up in the parish next to St. Mary's, Lady of Lords at Plain. And I have an aunt who lived at St. Mary's on my Irish side. And her child was not allowed to attend the parochial school. St. Mary's did not have a school.
It didn't.
So was that the pastor's decision at St. Mary's, or was it an archdiocesan that they lived on the wrong side of the street and could not attend parochial school?
I really don't know. That's a great question. What decade would that have been?
50s, early 50s.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question.
My mother and her Irish sisters, if a priest or a nun ever did anything wrong, they were always right. The priests and nuns were always right. So,
yeah, and that was such a complicated period for St. Mary of the Angels too, because again, this dynamic of treating really small or poor parishes as kind of dumping grounds for terrible priests. We tend to think of that as something that was sort of a post-60s phenomenon because that's when we have records and testimonies from. But in fact, St. Mary's is this is a little tangent, but it's interesting. St. Mary's is this tiny, tiny parish in Eggleston Square, right near Franklin Park. And it was built in 1906 when all, migration from Ireland and Germany and Italy was all, everybody was settling in the areas. That's where like the Sam Adams brewery is. There was breweries, there was tanneries, and there was so many European immigrants. And they thought, oh yeah, let's build 1 million parishes. And they carved out this little parish. And then immediately they were like, this was not a good idea because there were actually very few Catholics in this particular chunk of neighborhood that they had carved out to be St. Mary's. And they tried to raise the money for a parish. They dug the foundation. They tried to raise the rest of the money for the church, and they couldn't raise the money, so they put a roof over the basement. And it's still a basement with a roof today. You can go there today. It's still a base. It's right next to the Eggleston Square Library. It's a basement with a roof. There's no primary church. All the gathering space is in the parish house next door, which is this old farmhouse. Where was I going with that? Oh, so it was a really poor parish from the get-go, from the jump. And they sent, and it was in a predominantly Jewish area as well. So they also, that was a source of bias and prejudice. And so they sent this absolute tyrant of a priest. He was there for 37 years. I'm 38. That is like my entire life. Imagine, he was there for 37 years. And the archives, again, archival research is just reading dead people's mail. It's very fun. I really commend all of the students just to go and read some dead people's mail. It just because one thing the Catholic Church is very good at is record keeping. And they hold on to things, even things that do not reflect well on the institution, and you can read them. And priest after priest, priests would be sent to serve alongside this guy. And they would write to the Archbishop and say, you need to get me out of here. I've been a priest for 30 years and this is the worst thing I've ever seen, and he's so mean and he's abusive and he's a tyrant and he's horrible. And instead, they did nothing. And they said, well, this is a tiny parish. They don't really matter and they don't raise any money. And so we're gonna strap them with this horrible, horrible priest who basically drove the whole institution into the ground. So that doesn't answer your question exactly, but it's sort of more evidence, right, that these cultures of abuse are really intertwined with a lot of different factors that are worth paying attention to.
Susan, this is.
Can we give you the microphone?
Sure. Susan, this is a spectacular presentation. So moving, emotional, and to thank you profoundly for it. You do us proud as a graduate or a PhD doctorate in theology and education. And we're
I'm
very
getting
proud
a
of
plug in for the program.
just in passing. This may not be a fair question to put to you at all, but I am sitting here wondering about, and if there's any wisdom you might have or data, is clergy sex abuse more prevalent among Catholic clergy than other traditions?
It's not, no. It's not more prevalent among Catholic clergy than non-Catholic clergy, and it's not more prevalent in religious institutions than it is in other kinds of institutions. So that's interesting, right? Like that's also a fact. And at the same time, right, we don't want to say like, well, it's this, you know, and one is too many, one case is too many. I think the thing that is sort of the guiding question for those of us who do this kind of work is a question that was articulated well by Bob Orsi, whose first book I read in Mark's class and made me want to become a theologian, even though he's a historian. And he has really turned in this sort of, I shouldn't say sunset of his career, but that he's nearing retirement, and he's really focused a lot on clergy abuse now, researcher of American Catholicism. And he articulates the question is, what is Catholic about clergy sexual abuse? Like that's the question that I think is a very motivating question for those of us who study this, right? Because it's, on the one hand, abuse happens in every institution. It just does. That's a statistic fact. But it's worth our time, right, as researchers, as theologians, as people of faith, to really think about what are the contours of how this is perpetrated in Catholic contexts. And why does there seem to be such a particular kind of deep, lasting psychological harm associated with clergy sexual abuse? And what we find very often is the way in which abuse is perpetrated, often implicitly or directly, binds up those acts of violence with a kind of spiritual, sacramental, liturgical, theological significance that makes them sort of compounds the violence done, especially to children. The way that power operates in the church, the particular cultures of silence within an all-male clergy, the particular kind of culture of obedience and authority that a hierarchical institution inculcates, right, tells us something, I think, really important about how power is abused in all kinds of institutions. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? And the answer is no, abuse happens everywhere. But I think it's helpful for us as Catholics, as people of faith, to think about, first of all, on a very basic level, how can we prevent this so that it happens never? And second, how can we dream of remaking an institution that doesn't harm people in this way?
Maddie, as you're bringing the mic over to Yasmin's here, and then you. Actually, Tom, I just reviewed a great book by Christian Smith, who's a sociologist of religion at Notre Dame, and he wrote a book called Why Religion Went Obsolete in the United States. And what he finds is exactly what Susan said, that the one factor that runs across all of the cases is gender. So among evangelical Protestants, mainstream Protestants, among Jews and Catholics, the major factor seems to be gender.
What's so interesting too, and just I see your, I'll take your question in just a second, but it's, I have learned so much. I teach at Candler School of Theology, which is a Methodist seminary within a research university, Emory University. And last January, I taught a January term course, like a short course on abuse, on, what did I call it? A church and abuse in ecumenical perspective. So I had 2 Catholic students, and the rest of my students were mainline Protestant and Pentecostal. And the ecumenical learning that we did from each other, I think everybody in the room started out by thinking this is a Catholic problem. But I had students do research on their own contexts, and there was not a single student in the room who was not touched in some way by a sex scandal, an issue of sexual abuse, an issue of like spiritual abuse is a term that a lot of my students, especially those who are raised in fundamentalist backgrounds, use, like other forms of gender-based manipulation in religious settings. And it was the first time that I've ever engaged in a real ecumenical learning and discussion in a free and open way about the problem of abuse in the church. And it was unbelievably generative. And so I think also it's just a plug for like learning more from one another. I think because there's a perception that it's a Catholic problem, there's also like a tendency among our Protestant brothers and sisters to be like, well, we're not like that. You know, we have our problem, we're not like that. And it's like, no, actually, this is all refractions of a same kind of culture, right? A culture of power and a distorted understanding of sex and gender.
Yes.
Yeah, Susan, thank you very much for your story. It's a deeply uncomfortable story, and full disclosure, I'm a Jesuit priest, and I sometimes feel the need to go to these things almost as an act of contrition to take it in, and as an act also of respect to as victims. So it's uncomfortable, but thank you still. I have a simple question that is maybe complicated too.
Yeah.
And the simple question is, what can we do to get clergy used to listening to women? It's a simple question. The complication is that in many of seminaries in this country, and I think in other countries too, you have a culture, it's the very clerical culture that makes that women cannot be professors, students don't study with women. In some of my classes, I have just these incredibly smart women that ask critical questions. You can't hide, can you? But in the seminary, you can. So the simple question, how can we almost get them used to it, is in fact complicated, I think. So thank you for your thoughts.
Great. Well, thanks for being here. And that's a great question. I mean, I of course, I want to say like synodality. Yay. And also, right, I think it was really powerful for me to listen to the stories of female colleagues who participated actively in the synodal process, and just their own lived experience of having to really sit with the feeling that they were being perhaps listened to but not heard, or heard but not listened to. I can't decide which one of those is deeper. But right, there's that sort of credibility gap, right? That sort of epistemological gap where there, because of the way that power has been instantiated in the church over hundreds and thousands of years, there is this implicit discrediting or disbelief, even a very gentle or light dismissal of the experience of women. And it's very painful, right, to be in a process where you know that, okay, I'm speaking as you are, but I feel that you're not listening, right? Yeah.
So, but where is a beginning point? I'm looking for a beginning point.
I mean, I think the synodal process is a beginning point because, what's equally powerful to me is listening to the testimony of bishops who talked about, at the beginning of this process, I was really not here for this. And I was participating begrudgingly, and I thought this was annoying and the waste of my time. And actually found themselves incredibly moved by the process. And that really does give me hope. I think that's where we start, honestly.
So thank you so much for this. I know her. I went to school with Dr. Reynolds, and I'm glad my students are here to be listening from you and learning more about something we haven't gotten to cover, but that's really important.
They've had a very distressing time.
Yeah, sorry in advance. We'll talk about it in class, but I'm wondering, you started to answer, maybe synodality would be your answer, but if there's a way in which, as institutions, human institutions, have all suffered this abuse in all of the ways across history and time, is there a way where you see the Catholic Church could perhaps, in its own healing process, like we have the Catholic social teaching model, try to sort of model and say, hey, look, this is what we're doing, maybe we could help other institutions? Do you see threads of that? Would it be synodality? Are there other things?
Yes, and this was also something that really surprised me in the course that I taught was, again, part of the reason why people know so much about clergy sexual abuse in Catholic contexts is because the Catholic Church is an unbelievably dense and connected global transnational information sharing network. And the record keeping is unbelievably robust. I think the Catholic Church probably keeps records better and more thoroughly than any institution like in the world, truly, of that size and scale. And accordingly, because of the interconnected nature of the global Catholic Church, which led to the cascade effect of, I mean, we all know that, revelations of abuse did not begin in 2002, but that was a new moment, right? Boston, and then it was one after another because the investigative journalists in every single major media outlet throughout the entire United States and world turned a spotlight, no pun intended, on their own diocese. And within 5 years, I mean, you had these major exposés in every diocese, effectively in the United States. And then, of course, in 2000, quite immediately, you had the Dallas Charter, imperfect, but a very immediate and concrete response. And then after 2018, again, the Pennsylvania grand jury was incredibly important, not only for its own context, but because it occasioned for the first time a global reckoning with clergy sexual abuse on a systemic scale. I'm sure, we look at the interventions of, recent popes, of, the institutional church and think nothing is enough, it's insufficient. But I will say, Pope Francis, for the first time, was the first pope ever to state in no uncertain terms and in procedural terms that clergy sexual abuse is not a problem of the West. It's not a problem of liberal Western culture. It's a problem of the world, for the world. And the kinds of reporting guidelines that are present in one context need to be present throughout the entire world. It was very, very important, actually. And so as a result, the Catholic Church has done so much of this reckoning. And my students, and I say students, they're graduate students, some of them are, pastors and they're like on their way to becoming bishops in their context. So these are leaders saying, we have nothing like this. We don't have procedures like this. We don't have statements like this. We don't have policies like this. We don't have disclosures. We don't have and so in a way, the Catholic Church is a model of, an imperfect model of reckoning in a really rigorous and open-eyed way, not perfectly, not always even well, but a real reckoning with the reality of abuse on a policy level, and to a certain degree, I think, on a theological level. It's a good question.
We have one right here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm also a Susan super fan. My question.
We go way back.
My question for you. Thank you for your presentation. You're a theologian, you're a professor, but you're also an active parishioner, and you're a mom of 3 girls. What advice or words of wisdom do you have for us in formational roles of young women that will hopefully stay in the church?
Gosh, I know. Great question. If anybody else has any, no. One thing that's just really been interesting to me is having kids that have grown up with virtues training as part of their annual Sunday school curriculum. And that is really interesting because on the one hand, right, virtues training feels very pro forma, and it's important, and it's like also an obligation and annoying and everything. But it's fine. It's very good. But it's, as part of that, it's built into it's built into the curriculum of their Sunday school, of their faith formation, that there's Virtue Sunday. So once a year they have a conversation at an age appropriate level about like bodies and boundaries and, you know, safe and appropriate touching and, you know, things like that. And that's just really interesting too, because it's so normal to my kids that like they talk about it in a really interesting way. It's interesting for me, like that culture of, I don't know what we would call it, consent or just open dialogue, even within the church, has been interesting to experience as an adult. I do a lot of community theater, church-based community theater, and that's obviously a really intergenerational sort of situation where you have young kids and adults and old people, and also a situation, right, it's theater where you're like changing costumes and things like that. And even just like the culture of safety around like, okay, I'm gonna unbutton your, is that okay if I do that? With young kids, like practicing in this very safe and benign way, this culture of like body consent. And that's like, those are two like microscopically tiny examples, but like that's been really interesting for me as like a mom and a parishioner. And I love, it's just a very different space of like regarding one's own body than I certainly grew up in, which was just like, don't talk about it, and also shame, and also like you're a girl, and like make sure that you're not tempting the boys with your, you know, like long dowdy 90s skirts that were certainly not a source of temptation for anyone. But no, that's a great question.
Hi, I'm Alexis. My question is sort of building off of that because, like, I'm excited for, you know, your girls to grow up one day and be hopefully like leaders in their ecclesial context, maybe if they choose. But I'm thinking about the generations we currently have, my generation and older. And I know you mentioned, you know, like the synodal process being like a starting point. But in your lecture, you know, you talked about women as not only perpetrators, but also apologists or defenders. And I think in this clerical culture, right, I think the first gentleman might have said something about, you know, his aunts believing like the priest is right, and this like specialism, if you want to call it that. And so anyway, I'm getting to, especially in places where pastors still have the power over whether or not we're going to implement synodality, et cetera. How do you see women in the church holding other women accountable to not buy into that culture, to believe other women? Because I think even though there is power imbalance and certainly a lot does have to change, from the patriarchy side, I think also like it's just fascinating how women can also be perpetuating this culture in larger society, but also within our church. So like, how do older women then like hold one another accountable?
Yeah, women are some of the best defenders of patriarchy, and I think that's a real pattern. I cited just a couple of examples of it, but a pattern in archives and in the testimony of victims was just how often people were disbelieved, or at least sort of willfully disbelieved by their own mothers, right? We tend to think of motherhood as this like untouchable bond of, you know, the mama bear instinct and defense of your children, but you know, we're all in this. We all swim in this, and I think one of the greatest tragedies of sort of patriarchy in general is this pitting of women against other women, right? This idea that whether it's in the church or the workplace or just in general society, right? There isn't room for two of us, you know, so if one of us is going to make it to the top, we're going to defend that tooth and nail. And we're taught to be suspicious of other women, of other women's motives, of other women's qualifications. And so again, it's not only right that men and clergy are sort of suspicious of women, you know, or that the tradition is suspicious of women. Women are suspicious of other women. And I think this is like where this synodal process has the capacity to be so beautiful. And you're right that in the current sort of especially very polarized ecclesial climate, so much of that is mediated by local bishops who either want nothing to do with the process or just kind of opt out, and then in so doing opt out their entire diocese from that process. I think that those spaces where women do listen to other women, whether it's, a Bible study or a small group or things like that. I mean, I think even if, people aren't calling it synodality, those spaces of listening within the liturgy and adjacent to the liturgy, not within the liturgy, adjacent to the liturgy, are so important because they kind of train us to practice that kind of listening. But yeah, it's a good question, and it's a tough question.
I have a question as well. Hello. You talked about victim in your case being from the margins. And so my question is more so for communities that are more vulnerable. How do you bridge the gap between that risk and as well as the extra emotional labor of whether or not to report or to do so?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing to say there is like that burden is social sin, right? Like that is injustice in its purest form, right? This sort of disproportionate, this forcing of communities on the margins to bear in this disproportionate way the brunt of this culture of abuse. It's hard because in some way the problem, it's an institutional problem. The responsibility, the burden, you can advise best practices, but there is no good should, right? There's no good ought there. The sin is with the institution that continues to perpetuate the production, essentially, of the very margins that it goes on to lament by, creating situations in which, one horrific priest is at a parish for 37 years and, by then the entire, neighborhood is in a state of distress, and then we're sending all of our bad priests there, and we're doing that intentionally because we know that these people lack the same kind of access to avenues of justice, and they're easily dismissed. So it's, in a sense, the only sort of, the only response I can think of is a response to the institution. I think creating other avenues for justice and like reporting. I mean, I think reporting procedures are one place where like this open-eyed understanding of who victims are is really important, right? If you have a hotline to call, to report abuse, well, that's great, but how are you publicizing it? In what languages are you publicizing it? Do people understand that by calling this hotline, they're not going to like touch the system if they're undocumented? Or what does calling the system or this hotline actually entail? Who's going to, who is it going to connect you with exactly? And what kind of trouble does that have the capacity to get you in, And so I think really for institutions thinking through like, not only, okay, we have these reporting procedures, but like, who do they work for? And who don't they work for? And who's going to need a lot more explanation and understanding in order to be able to access those reporting procedures? That's just one space I know that's been a topic of conversation in this respect. But yeah, that was a very disconnected answer. But like, yeah, the burden is with the institution.
The last question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your lecture and for the work that you're doing. So I should say I work on related issues within an Irish context. And I was thinking about that moment in your talk when you got to, and there were even perpetrators. And I appreciate the marker that you made later about placing that and then moving to the wonderful talk that you gave. So I think I have a question, maybe an observation. The question is, I'm thinking about how an Irish context maps into this, and the space between St. Mary's in Boston, or a Boston context, and Indigenous Native American boarding schools is the place of women in the Catholic Church in institutions. And so the fact that there were Magdalene asylums in the United States, there were girls' industrial schools in the United States, and there were maternity homes where forced family separation occurred in the United States. And that's that's a space in between where other stories and other stories of all the ways in which women in the church, many of the women in those institutions were Catholic, but there were perpetrators in those institutions too. I was going to ask if you're aware of any conversations around that particular setting as a site of clergy abuse. So that's the question. But the related observation is we at Boston College are currently building the Catholic Religious Congregations archive. And I was, so one of the things that was so compelling in your talk was your advocacy for work in the archive and the ways in which the archives help us to understand new truths and truths that are yet to be discovered. And I just wonder whether or not you would want to speak to them. But if you're not aware of it, I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable position. But I wonder how Boston College's Catholic Religious Congregations archive can support and assist in this type of work. I hope it's part of the agenda.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'll answer both parts of your question. What's interesting is that there's been a lot more work done on the Irish context than there has on the US context when it comes to the nuns, especially in religious orders, being sort of perpetrated, women's religious orders being perpetrators and kind of often like incubators of violence in violent systems, with the exception of Native American boarding schools. There's been a little bit more research in Canadian context. Well, actually quite a bit more research in the Canadian context. But most of the studies that I'm aware of actually come out of the Irish context. Which is kind of interesting that this is kind of like an major understudied dimension of the US Catholic landscape of with respect to women's religious congregations. I think in part, not necessarily causally, but I think a lot of, there's a fear, I'm speculating, I think there's a fear that people have that if they go down that road, then it'll undo all of the rah-rah work that's been done around histories of nuns and women's religious in the United States. That's me speculating. But in terms of archival work, yeah, there's nothing that compares. But I think particularly when researching histories like this, I think theologians make, and this is self-incriminating of all of us, there's this urge to sort of theologize out of a wound that's sort of like, okay, well, if we just, sharpened our preferential option for the poor, then like we would solve this. Like, what needs to be done? What's the theological intervention that will fix this, that will make this better? And I think what doing archival work has taught me as a theologian, as somebody trained in theology, systematic theology especially, is that first and foremost, theology is a diagnostic tool, right? It's helpful first and foremost in saying what gives these acts so much power, right? What's the kind of religious and theological culture that gave rise to, the kinds of institutions where these things are swept under the rug in a particular kind of way, right? What was the theological understanding of scandal, for example? And like, how does understanding what we meant theologically by scandal actually open up an entirely new way of understanding how this culture of secrecy arose? And only secondarily, right, is theology a tool for like solving a problem. But good theology is really important, and bad theology kills people. But it's not only a matter of, gosh, if we just got our theology right, if we just got our theology of Eucharist right, if we just got our preferential option for the poor right, all of this would go away. No, right? Attending to particular stories, right? We might think, gosh, she spent like 40 minutes talking about like one story, but really attending to particular stories, particular histories, and going as deep as we can I think helps us, especially as theologians, to kind of sober up a little bit, right? We have a big, wow, so many theological ideas, but spending time with the words, with the names, with the stories, with the handwriting of people, of real people, it sharpens, I think, that, and it also chastens that urge to like solve things with a magical theological bullet.
Please join me in. Thank you.